In 1934, Carl Jung wrote something that most people in his era dismissed as pessimism. He warned that modern society was creating a new kind of human being, one who was highly educated, technically sophisticated, and psychologically incomplete. A person who understood the world around them, but had almost no understanding of the world within them. And he argued that this inner blindness would eventually show up most clearly in one place above all others: their relationships. Not because people were becoming worse, because they were becoming more unconscious of the forces driving them. 90 years later, the data suggests he was right. In 2024, the American Psychological Association reported that relationship satisfaction in the United States has declined for 3 consecutive decades. The divorce rate remains above 40%, and the fastest growing demographic of people who report feeling chronically alone is adults in committed relationships, not single people. Chronically alone, while technically partnered. Jung called this phenomenon the meeting of two people who don't know themselves, and the inevitable collision that follows. In this video, we're going through exactly what Jung warned about, what he believed was causing it, and what he thought the only real solution was. Let's get into it. First, who was Carl Jung, and why does it matter? Before the warnings, you need to understand who was doing the warning. Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who spent 5 decades studying the human psyche, not from the outside, but from the inside. He worked directly with patients experiencing the full range of human psychological experience. He read mythology, philosophy, religion, and anthropology, looking for patterns in how human beings understand themselves. And his central conclusion was this: most human suffering, including most relationship suffering, is not caused by external circumstances. It's caused by what he called unconsciousness. The parts of ourselves we haven't examined, the patterns we run automatically without knowing it, the needs we have but can't name, the wounds we carry but refuse to look at. Jung believed that until a person does the work of understanding their own interior, their fears, their needs, their patterns, their shadow, they will keep recreating the same problems in every relationship they enter. Not because they're bad people, because they don't know themselves. And modern relationships, he argued, were making this worse, not better. Here's why. Warning number 1, the shadow problem. Jung's most important concept, and his most misunderstood, is the shadow. The shadow is not your dark side in the dramatic sense. It's simpler and more uncomfortable than that. The shadow is everything you've decided you are not. When you were young, you learned, through family, culture, experience, which parts of yourself were acceptable and which parts needed to be hidden or suppressed. Maybe anger wasn't allowed in your house. Maybe vulnerability was treated as weakness. Maybe needing people was something you were taught to be ashamed of. So you pushed those parts down, you buried them. You built an identity, what Jung called the persona, that presented only the acceptable parts. And you told yourself, I'm not angry, I'm not needy, I'm not afraid. But the shadow doesn't disappear when you suppress it. It goes underground, and from underground, it runs you. In relationships, the shadow shows up in 2 ways. The first is projection. You take the parts of yourself you've refused to acknowledge, your anger, your jealousy, your fear of abandonment, and you see them in your partner instead. You become convinced that they are controlling or cold or unreliable, when in reality, you're looking at a mirror. The quality you're reacting to most intensely in them is almost always the quality you've most aggressively suppressed in yourself. The second is attraction. Jung argued that we are often most powerfully drawn to people who carry our shadow for us, people who embody the qualities we've buried in ourselves. The controlled person is drawn to the spontaneous one. The responsible person is drawn to the free-spirited one. The emotionally shut down person is drawn to the intensely feeling one. This is why the qualities that initially attract us to someone are almost always the qualities that later create the most conflict. Not because love fades, because we haven't integrated those qualities in ourselves. We needed them in another person because we couldn't access them within. And relationships built on this dynamic, on 2 people carrying each other's shadows, eventually collapse under the weight of what's been projected. Jung's warning was direct. Until you face your shadow, you will keep recreating the same relationship, with different people in different settings with the same outcome. Warning number 2, the persona trap. Connected to the shadow is what Jung called the persona, the mask we present to the world. The persona is not dishonesty. It's the social self, the version of you that knows how to behave in public, how to present yourself professionally, how to be likable, appropriate, and acceptable. The persona is useful. The problem arrives when you lose track of where the persona ends and where you actually begin. And Jung believed that modern society was making this confusion worse, because modern society increasingly rewards the persona over the authentic self. In relationships, the persona problem shows up early. In the beginning, people show their best selves. They are patient, attentive, generous, and emotionally available. And often, those qualities are genuine, but heightened, performed slightly more consistently than is actually sustainable. Over time, the persona becomes exhausting to maintain, and the authentic self, with all its needs, contradictions, and complications, begins to emerge. What follows is what most people call the honeymoon ending, but Jung would call it something different. He'd call it the first real meeting. Because the initial attraction was often between two personas, two curated presentations, two people showing their most acceptable selves. The real relationship, the one with potential for genuine depth, only begins when the personas come down. The warning Jung issued was this: a relationship built primarily between two personas is not a relationship between two people. It's a relationship between two performances. And performances can't sustain intimacy. The question he posed was uncomfortable. Are you showing your partner who you actually are? Or are you showing them who you believe they need you to be? Most people, if honest, spend years in relationships answering that question with the second option, and then wonder why they feel unseen. Warning number 3, the anima and animus problem. This is one of Jung's more complex ideas, but in the context of relationships, it may be his most practically important. Jung argued that every person carries within them an inner representation of the opposite gender. In men, he called this the anima, an inner feminine figure shaped by early experiences with women, particularly the mother, and by cultural images of femininity. In women, he called it the animus, an inner masculine figure shaped by early experiences with men, particularly the father, and by cultural images of masculinity. These inner figures are not passive. They actively shape who we are attracted to and what we expect from our partners. And here's where the warning comes in. When a person hasn't examined their anima or animus, when they haven't become conscious of the inner template they're carrying, they will unconsciously project it onto real people. A man who hasn't examined his anima will meet a woman and see in her not who she actually is, but who his inner feminine template needs her to be. He'll fall in love with a projection. And when she inevitably fails to match the projection, when she turns out to be a real, complex, contradictory human being rather than the image he needed her to be, he'll experience it as disappointment or betrayal. Not because she changed, because he was never fully seeing her. The same dynamic operates in reverse. Jung's warning was clear. Most people fall in love not with another person, but with a projection of their own inner world cast onto another person's face. And the relationship that follows is built on a fundamental confusion. Two people relating not to each other, but to idealized versions of each other that neither can ultimately sustain. The work he prescribed was individuation, the process of becoming conscious of these inner figures, integrating them within yourself, so that you can meet another person as they actually are, rather than as you need them to be. Warning number 4, the unconscious repetition problem. Jung had a phrase that has since become one of the most quoted in all of psychology. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. In relationships, this principle is devastating in its accuracy. Most people believe that their relationship patterns are circumstantial. They chose the wrong person. They had bad luck. The timing was off. The other person changed. Jung argued that the pattern is almost never circumstantial. The pattern is internal. And until the internal pattern is examined and understood, it will reproduce itself, in every relationship, with every new person, as reliably as a biological process. The person who grew up with an emotionally unavailable parent will consistently find themselves attracted to emotionally unavailable partners. Not because they're masochistic, because the nervous system finds the familiar comfortable, even when the familiar is painful. The person who learned early that love comes with conditions will recreate conditional love in every relationship they enter, either by choosing conditional partners or by behaving in ways that invite conditionality. The person who was abandoned will find abandonment following them across relationships, across decades, across entirely different circumstances, because the unconscious is arranging the stage to replay the original wound, hoping this time it will resolve differently. Jung called this compulsion to repeat one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and his warning about modern relationships was that modern culture had made it easier than ever to keep changing the external circumstances, new partner, new city, new beginning, while leaving the internal pattern completely untouched. Dating apps in particular, he might argue, have industrialized the ability to escape a pattern without ever facing it. You can now replace a relationship faster than the discomfort of examining yourself has time to arrive. The solution, Jung argued, was not to stay in painful relationships. It was to do the interior work before bringing the unexamined self into another person's life. Warning number 5, the individuation problem in relationships. This is perhaps Jung's deepest and most challenging warning. Jung believed that every human being has a fundamental drive, as deep and as powerful as the drive for food or safety, toward what he called individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming fully yourself, of integrating all the parts of yourself, the shadow, the persona, the inner figures, into a coherent, conscious, authentic whole. It is, in his view, the central psychological task of a human life. And here's where his warning about relationships becomes most uncomfortable. Many relationships, he argued, actively work against individuation, not because love is incompatible with growth, but because many relationships are unconsciously structured around keeping both people small. When two people come together primarily out of fear of loneliness, fear of inadequacy, fear of facing themselves, they often create a dynamic that prioritizes comfort over growth. They avoid the conversations that might lead somewhere difficult. They suppress the needs that might create conflict. They become, over time, a system optimized for stability, rather than two individuals optimized for becoming. Jung observed that the most damaging relationships are often the most comfortable ones, the ones where both people have silently agreed never to challenge each other too deeply. Because that comfort has a price. The price is the parts of yourself that could only develop through friction, through honest confrontation, through the discomfort of being truly known and occasionally disagreed with. A relationship that never challenges you is a relationship that is slowly shrinking you. His warning was not that relationships are bad for growth. His warning was that unconscious relationships entered for the wrong reasons, maintained through avoidance, and structured around keeping the peace rather than telling the truth, are one of the most effective ways to stop growing entirely. The alternative he described was what he called a conscious relationship, one where both people are committed not just to each other's comfort, but to each other's becoming. A relationship where honesty is valued over harmony, where growth is prioritized over stability, where both people feel safe enough to show the parts of themselves that are still incomplete, still developing, still afraid. Warning number 6, the meaning problem. Jung's final warning about modern relationships is the one most relevant to the world we're living in now. He argued that human beings cannot sustain love, or anything else, without meaning. That when a relationship is asked to be the primary source of meaning in a person's life, the main reason to get up, the main source of joy, the primary container for all emotional experience, it will collapse under that weight. Because no human being can be another person's entire meaning. The demand is too great. The expectation is too total. And yet modern culture has increasingly pushed toward exactly this dynamic. The romantic partner has become, for many people, the replacement for what previous generations found in community, in religion, in shared purpose, in extended family.
We have asked the relationship to do everything, to provide companionship, sexual fulfillment, intellectual stimulation, emotional support, personal validation, social belonging, and existential meaning, simultaneously, consistently, indefinitely. And then we're surprised when it fails. Jung argued that a relationship can only be healthy when both people bring a life that already has meaning into it. When both people have a relationship with something larger than the partnership itself. A purpose, a creative practice, a community, a set of values. Something that existed before the relationship and would survive it. Because when a person has their own source of meaning, when they are not using the relationship to fill a void that only internal work can fill, they bring something into the relationship rather than extracting something from it. And that difference between a person who brings and a person who extracts is often the difference between a relationship that deepens and a relationship that slowly exhausts itself. What all 6 warnings have in common. The thread connecting all of Jung's warnings is the same. Most relationship problems are not relationship problems. They are individuation problems. They're the problems of people who haven't yet done the interior work of understanding themselves, and who are therefore unconsciously using their relationships to avoid that work. The shadow projects onto the partner what the person hasn't faced in themselves. The persona keeps the relationship at the surface by preventing either person from being fully seen. The anima and animus cause people to fall in love with projections rather than with real human beings. The repetition compulsion recreates old wounds in new relationships until the original wound is finally examined. The avoidance of individuation keeps both people small in the name of keeping the peace. And the absence of personal meaning places an impossible demand on the relationship to provide what only inner work can produce. Jung's prescription was not complex,
but it was demanding. Know yourself. Face your shadow. Distinguish your persona from your authentic self. Become conscious of the inner templates you're projecting onto others. Examine the patterns you keep repeating. Build a life with meaning that doesn't depend entirely on another person. And then, from that place of greater consciousness, bring yourself into relationship with another person who is doing the same work. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. Because the only alternative, the unconscious relationship, the one built on projection and avoidance and unexamined need, will always reproduce the same outcome. Different person, different setting, same collision. Jung wrote this almost a century ago. He didn't have dating apps. He didn't have social media. He didn't have a culture that could deliver the illusion of connection at industrial scale while leaving the interior completely untouched. But he understood the mechanism. He understood that the external world, however much it changed, would never solve what was fundamentally an internal problem. And he left behind a body of work that functions, in many ways, as a set of instructions. Not instructions for finding the right person. Instructions for becoming a person capable of sustaining what love actually requires. Which of Jung's 6 warnings resonated most with you? Drop a number in the comments. And if you want to understand how these unconscious patterns show up in specific relationship behaviors, watch this next. The psychology of people who attract toxic relationships. Because Jung's warnings aren't theoretical. They show up in real patterns, in real choices, in real relationships, including yours. See you there.